Welcome to our explainer. Today, we're going to talk about two sides of the same coin: money, the amazing tool that helped build our world, and credit, its powerful twin that can be a ladder to your dreams or a trap that's hard to escape. It's a story of human ingenuity, of risk, and the systems we've built to handle both.
So let's just jump right in with a huge question. Is borrowing money a golden ticket or a one-way trip to trouble? Well, the wild thing is, it can be both. Let's dive into the story of how we ended up with a system that can make fortunes or completely break lives.
So to really wrap our heads around our modern system, we've got to go back in time, way back. Picture a world with no cash, no coins, no credit cards. A world that runs on nothing but barter.
Okay, so let's meet our first character. He's a shoe manufacturer, and a pretty good one at that. He's made some fantastic shoes, and all he wants in the world is to trade them for some wheat so he can feed his family. Simple enough, right?
Yeah, not so fast. The wheat farmer takes one look at the shoes and says, "Nope, sorry pal, I don't need shoes. What I really need is some new clothes." And boom, the deal's off. The shoemaker's stuck, and this little problem was actually a massive headache for early economies.
You know, this problem actually has a fancy name, the double coincidence of wants. It basically means that for any trade to work, I need to find someone who has exactly what I want and who wants exactly what I have. You can see how this would be a total drag, right? Super inefficient. So, what was our big, genius solution to this mess? Money. It acts like a go-between for everyone. The shoemaker can just sell his shoes to anybody for money and then use that money to buy wheat from the farmer. Problem solved. But this brilliant solution leads to a new problem, a much better one for sure, but still a problem. What do you do with all that extra cash?
Well, you put it in a bank, right? It's safe, maybe you earn a little interest, but here's where it gets really interesting. The bank doesn't just let that money collect dust. They keep a small piece of it on hand, just in case you need to make a withdrawal, and then they lend out the rest to other people who want to buy a house or start a business. Banks are basically the matchmakers for the entire economy.
In all that lending, that's what we call credit. It's getting something now with a promise to pay for it later. And it can be an incredible engine for growth and opportunity. But, as we're about to see, it is definitely a double-edged sword. So let's see how this plays out through two totally different stories.
Okay, on one hand, you've got Saleem, our shoe manufacturer again. He lands a massive order, so he uses credit to buy the materials he needs. He makes the shoes, delivers the order, pays back his loan, and makes a nice profit. For him, credit was a total game changer, a real ladder up. But then, on the other hand, there's Swapna, a small farmer. She takes out a loan for her farming costs, but then disaster strikes and pests wipe out her entire crop.
And just like that, Swapna's caught in what we call a debt trap. That loan, the one that was supposed to be a lifeline, is now just an anchor dragging her down. She can't pay it back, the interest keeps piling up, and in the end, she's forced to sell off a piece of her land just to settle the debt. For her, credit was a total nightmare.
So, what's the deal here? Why was the outcome so different for these two people? Well, it all comes down to the conditions of the loan, what we call the terms of credit, and maybe most importantly, who they borrowed the money from.
One of the biggest pieces of the puzzle is something called collateral. See, when you get a loan from a formal place like a bank, they often want a guarantee, some kind of asset you own, like land or a house, that they can take if you can't pay them back. Now, this makes total sense for the lender, but it's a massive wall for poor folks who might not have any assets to offer up as a guarantee.
And this chart, wow, it really shows you what's happening on the ground in rural India. Sure, formal places like banks make up the biggest piece of the pie, but look at that big chunk from moneylenders. That's almost a quarter of all loans. And these are informal lenders who can charge whatever interest they want, which can easily lead someone right into a debt trap.
And believe it or not, this gap gets even wider when you look at cities. For poor households in urban areas, a whopping 54% of their loans come from these same risky, informal sources. They're basically stuck going to these lenders because the main system has its doors closed to them.
Okay, now check out the other side of the coin. For rich households, it's a completely different story. A mind-blowing 83% of their loans come from formal, safer sources with much lower interest rates. So yeah, it's pretty clear the system is not working the same way for everyone.
Okay, so we solved the barter problem with money. Great, but that just gave us a new challenge. Not everyone has equal access to fair credit. So what's the next big idea? Well, this is where people started getting really creative and building new systems from the ground up.
And this is where some really clever ideas come into play. like self-help groups, or SHGs. The concept is so simple, but wow, is it powerful. A small group of women, usually in a village, all agree to save a little bit of money regularly. They pool it all together, and that pool of money becomes their collective collateral, which allows the group to get a bigger loan from a real bank.
And you know what's amazing? These groups turn into so much more than just little banks. They become these incredible support networks where women can become financially independent, work together on community problems, and really build a collective voice. They're literally building change from the ground up.
Professor Muhammad Yunus, who actually won a Nobel Peace Prize for this kind of work, he really nailed it. He said that when you make credit available to the poor, all those millions of small efforts can add up to create something huge, something wonderful.
Wow, what a journey, right? From simple bartering all the way to banks, and now to these amazing community groups. So let's tie it all together with a quick final challenge to lock in the big ideas from this story.
All right, first question. When you boil it all down, what's the main job of a bank in our economy? How do they connect the dots?
That's it. They're the bridge, the middleman. They take in money from people who have extra, the savers, and then they channel that money out as loans to people who need it, the borrowers. They keep the whole economic engine humming.
Okay, last one, and this is the big one. Why is it so incredibly important that everyone gets a fair shot at getting a formal, affordable loan? Why does this matter so much?
Because when it comes right down to it, having access to fair and affordable credit is one of the biggest keys to a country's development. It's what lets people invest in themselves, grow their businesses, and build a better future. It can literally be the difference between getting by and getting trapped. Which kind of leaves us with the big question, doesn't it? How do we make sure this powerful tool, this double-edged sword, works for everyone and not just a lucky few?